Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. Happy to be with you. I am Tyler Donahue. In just a moment, you'll hear from my Lions 24/7 colleague, Daniel Gallen. We're going to work our way through the Penn State football lineup and sort through where things stand in the program's efforts to replace several starters from a playoff run. We're just about 6 weeks or so away from preseason camp opening here in Happy Valley. A lot to still work through in those competitions, but we'll give you the latest on what we're hearing from Penn State coaches, what we are gathering here on campus about who is ready to step up and push for starting roles at those different spots in the lineup. We're also going to have Tyler Calvaruso on board later on this episode. The latest observations from look at prospects at Penn State camp this week. We also have the Lasch Bash event coming up this weekend and a bunch of official visitors coming to Happy Valley as we see the June official visit window come to a close in a pretty significant way. A lot of interesting targets to work through with Tyler Calvaruso in just a little while right here on the podcast. If you didn't hear our last episode, which dropped on Tuesday, we had Tyler on for a pretty detailed recruiting conversation led off by the commitment of top 24/7 linebacker Elijah Littlejohn out of North Carolina. We have a detailed breakdown of that pickup for Penn State's 2026 recruiting class. A ton of feedback from last weekend's official visitors, which featured a 5-star offensive lineman and several important targets for Penn State. And so check that out if you missed it. But now we're going to get over to the team side of things for a bit here with Daniel Gallen, who we welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. Daniel, always good to get your perspective. And as I said, starting to peek around the corner a little bit at Penn State preseason camp. I know you're just back from a bit of a vacation. I've got a couple of trips lined up here in the next few weeks, but when all said and done and we have our fun, it's going to be time to get back to that field. And there are several starting jobs at stake for the Nittany Lions.
I know Big Ten Media Days is creeping up a little bit closer. Mark Brennan is texting me about flights for games in October. It really is really sneaking up that, I think that we're closer to Big Ten Media Days than we are to the blue-white game at this point. And it's gone by pretty fast, even though nothing has been happening. So yeah, I think it's a really good time to really turn our focus towards what we're going to see this fall.
I don't mean to shock you here, Daniel, but I'm pretty sure we're closer to seeing Penn State players back on the field in pads hitting each other than we are to the blue-white game at this stage. Things are moving quickly this offseason, and we'll see. And we'll begin with an All-American departure for Penn State. And Tyler Warren is now an Indianapolis Colts rookie. 104 catches last year as a senior for Penn State, a guy that did a bunch of damage on the ground as well, playing some of that Wildcat quarterback role. Finished 7th in Heisman Trophy voting, the highest finish for any Penn State player since Saquon Barkley when he was a star running back here. And ultimately, Tyler Warren kind of reshaped what we expect from a Penn State tight end. And there have been several good ones. He was preceded in the starting lineup by 3 consecutive second-round draft picks and a 4th-round draft pick who are all still playing in the NFL, and yet Tyler Warren took things up a notch. So, Daniel, we can talk about the blue chip talent that has been assembled by Ty Howell and the coaching staff in this room, but you've got to begin with the large absence of number 44, who was so pivotal to Penn State's playoff push last year.
Yeah, when Tyler Warren's departure leaves a huge void in production on this offense, but I think that James Franklin has explained it a little bit, that it's not just one tight end that's going to have to make it up, and it's not just 3 tight ends that's going to have to make it up. You would assume that with improved wide receiver play this year, that lessens the burden on the position, that it spreads that production out a little bit more evenly. But given the figure that Tyler Warren was and what he did last year, there is going to be a ton of attention on that spot, who steps up after him, what they're able to do. And I think right now that starts with Khalil Dinkins. He's the redshirt senior. We've seen him these past couple of years in that second and third role, reliable near the red zone, reliable on 4th down, not afraid to to get messy and do some blocking. Has Drew Aller's trust, has the offense's trust, and is someone who's just a physical presence and has really come along nicely in his development after arriving as a really, really raw prospect. So I think that when you talk about maybe a high floor, for this offense, I think you start with Dinkins, and then from there you go to Luke Reynolds, the former 5-star, who burned his red shirt last year, made one of the biggest plays of the season against Minnesota on special teams, and really appears poised after having a full year in the system really reshaping his body, arrived at 214 pounds, is listed at 252 pounds now. What he's able to do, taking this step forward. And then you have Andrew Rappleyea, who I think is a little bit of a wild card in the conversation. Had the season-ending injury early last fall. We haven't heard too much about where he is in his rehab, other than that it's progressing. I think James Franklin said that he should be good to go when fall camp rolls around. And we saw the video clip of him working out. What he is able to add, I think, is going to be one of the interesting storylines when it comes to the tight end position for him after missing a year. So I think those are the three names you have to start with. I think Joey Schlaffer is also in that wild card category. Third year in the program, another guy who's reshaped his body and has some interesting traits. And then you wonder, Andrew Lasch coming in as a very highly touted recruit. Is there a pathway for him to make an impact? Is he physically going to be ready to make an impact? Is he, how are you going to bring him along? What kind of opportunities are you going to get him to get his feet wet, maybe in non-con play? Where is all of that stacking up? So I think if you're Penn State, you're in a good situation in terms of the number of options you have to replace this one guy, especially knowing that if things go well at a different position, that you don't need to find a 100 catch guy, a Heisman Trophy, candidate from this pool right now.
I'll make a bold prediction. None of those guys you just mentioned will reach 100 receptions in 2025. I will say, Andrew Lasch, Luke Reynolds, maybe you stacked back-to-back number one tight end recruits. There's a conversation to be had about Lasch in that being atop the pecking order of all tight ends in the 2025 class. What I'm reminding myself of, and I'll remind listeners out there and viewers out there regarding Lasch, is yes, he carried a lot of those traits and they shined a bit during spring ball. I think the feedback we got was pretty strong. Of course, it always ends with, but he needs to put on 20 plus pounds. And we saw Luke Reynolds do that last year. But what would Luke Reynolds' role have been last year if Andrew Rappleyea didn't go down in the second week of practice during the season? He may have been a redshirt. We know he ended up coming up and playing a considerable ball. He was involved in playoff action a bit. He had that really important fake punt run against Minnesota to help keep the Golden Gophers from upsetting Penn State, maybe derailing those playoff ambitions. But if Rappleyea is available, and we know what Dinkins meant to this team, Dinkins had about a 50% snap share last season. Tyler Warren was up there near 90% snap share. But I think it's important to know, just because you've got this special young prospect, you don't got to, what do you call it when you got money, burning a hole in your pocket? You don't have to feel like you've got to rush that guy out there, and certainly not in this tight end room, because you had to do it a bit with Luke Reynolds last year because of the circumstances with Rappley's injury. But if those three guys can be available for you consistently, Dinkins, Rappleyea, and then, of course, Luke Reynolds, then I don't see a lot of daylight for Andrew Lasch to get out there and get meaningful reps, just because I have a lot of confidence in what those top three guys can bring to the field. I'm glad you mentioned Joey Schlaffer because of what he's done with his body, because of all the experience he was able to kind of accrue during spring ball this year. He's more compelling than he's ever been at any other point in his career. But it's hard to look past Khalil Dinkins. I think people maybe are a little bit, quick to look past his name because he's been around the program a while. They've seen him a bit. Maybe they feel they have him figured out. But remember, he was banged up last year in preseason camp a bit, cost him the start of the season. But he started 6 of the last 12 games last year. He was averaging more than 30 snaps per contest in the Big Ten championship and then the 3 ensuing playoff games. And man for man, coach for coach in that building, they will tell you he is as tenacious a blocker that they have on this offensive plan. And so Khalil Dinkins has shown the soft hands. He's shown the ability to make clutch catches in key situations. We just haven't seen it at a high volume clip. And I think my feelings on Andrew Rappleyea have been, pretty well publicized on this particular podcast over the last several years. I thought last year he had breakout candidate written all over him. Didn't happen because of obvious reasons. But remember, he was the tight end who started next to Tyler Warren in the 2024 season opener. And I got to say, just really interested in what he showed in that little highlight film he posted from training. And then Luke Reynolds is just obviously undeniable from an athletic standpoint. The Mike Gesicki comparisons and going up and getting the football, but more of a physical specimen than I think Mike was during his Penn State career. He can get to that point as well in the coming years. So not a lot of room to complain about what you have to work with there if you're Ty Howell and a Penn State fan. But I think we all are curious to see what it looks like. And to Daniel's point, do we see 12 personnel as a staple of a starting lineup for Penn State? Is it a package that we see quite a bit, or do we see more 3 wide receiver setups? Do we see 2 running back setups, maybe cut into those looks as well? A lot to sort through for Andy Kotelnicki and this offensive staff. And of course, at wide receiver, you lost some starters, but no one's crying about it all that much here in State College like they might be with Tyler Warren. Harrison Wallace, Amari Evans, they are elsewhere in the power conference conversation now. Harrison Wallace landed with Ole Miss, and then you have Amari Evans continuing his career in the Big Ten with the Washington Huskies. But these are 2 guys that, for the faults of this receiver room, they were the default top 2 by the time we got down to the stretch last year. Liam Clifford played a bunch of ball. Julian Fleming played a bunch of ball. But each of them kind of disappeared in a way during the final stretch of the season from a production standpoint. We know nobody caught a pass in that receiver room against Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl. But when Drew Aller was looking downfield, if it wasn't Tyler Warren, it was typically Omari Evans or Harrison Wallace. With both of them gone, let's start with what Penn State lost, and then let's shift towards how they replace them. And certainly you look toward those trio of transfer pickups as looming large in that conversation.
Definitely. I think that this is the position that is going to have the most attention on it when you talk about replacing these starters and who steps in to do it. Wallace and Evans, I think it's well-trod territory, but for their faults, they brought some interesting elements. Evans' speed, ability to get behind the defenses. Wallace, while he never really returned to the heights of that West Virginia game, it was clear that Drew Aller would look to him in certain points to keep the chains moving. We never really saw the explosiveness consistently that I think a lot of people talked about. So there's a lot of production here for someone to compete for. Like I talked about with the tight ends, James Franklin has said that the number 3 tight end or number 3 wide receiver is competing with that number 2 tight end, for playing time. You brought up like maybe the number 2 running back is competing with the number 3 tight end, number 3 wide receiver, number 2 tight end. So you can really work things around to your strengths and stuff. But I think that when you talk about replacing these starters, a lot of talk about the newcomers, both transfers and freshmen. But I think we should touch on the guys who are coming back start because they will have a say in this. I think that Tyseer Denmark is someone who I think Tyseer Denmark is the type of guy that you're not just going to transfer in and take his spot. He is a competitive guy. Talking to him this offseason, he seems really determined to have a role. We didn't see too much of him last year, but he arrived last summer, so now he's got this full offseason with Penn State. The ability to physically get better, work through some things. I think Denmark is an interesting guy to watch. Caden Saunders, who knows? We'll see. He was someone that we really had circled going into last year as potentially interesting in the Andy Kotelnicki offense. Obviously, we did not see him take an offensive snap. 4th year in the program, not a lot to show for it. But I think that it's easy to close the book on him. But I think that he still does some unique things, and that he is someone too that I think you talked to him back in February, and he's another one of these guys that isn't just going to roll over because you got these newcomers coming in. And then Peter Gonzalez, another guy who missed last year to injury. He's another. He's unique in his body type, 6'2", 206. I know that Penn State, some of these newcomers are like Kyron Hudson, Jeff Exner, are bigger bodies, but Peter Gonzalez, fits into that category. Where is he at? What is he capable of doing? I think that I'm intrigued by what he can bring, and I think that he is someone too that shouldn't be discounted. And then just to round out, Liam Clifford, you know what you have in him. I think that he'll be out there in some capacity at different points. And then Anthony Ivy, we'll see. I think that, and then also Josiah Brown, another guy who was behind the scenes last year, but I think could do some interesting things with the ball in his hands. So I won't jump into the newcomers right now, but what do you think about what is returning for Penn State in terms of not immediately just turning the page to these new guys? Who do you think can force that issue a little bit?
Yeah, I think the problem here is, aside from Liam Clifford and that big collection that you just talked about, roster returners, is no one even showed they were really worthy of consistent reps last year at wide receiver. Like, no one was threatening to get in the starting lineup, but like Marcus Higgins wasn't looking at any of them and saying like, I need 12 reps out of you against Ohio State or even Maryland, right? And so to me, that's a big issue because you're talking about guys who have been on campus for 3-4 years in some cases, and now they've got this increased competition ahead of them. So outside of Liam Clifford and Tyseer Denmark, I have a little trouble seeing any of those guys threatening to emerge on August 30th in that starting lineup right now. Now, will they be two deep pieces, and will Penn State actually flex a real two deep at wide receiver this year? That's a question. Can you actually have 6 playable guys that you're counting on a week-to-week basis? Last year, they sure seemed scared to go beyond their top 4 guys, and 3 of those guys are no longer with the program. So we're going to learn a lot, but I still do really pivot towards the infusion of experienced talent. I think the interesting thing here is how do guys fit on the field? Because when you go 3 wide receivers, and we saw quite a bit of those sets in the spring game, and then you're talking about the slot position. Well, last year you saw Amari Evans maybe take a quarter of his snaps in the slot. It was largely Liam Clifford. You saw Julian Fleming there as well. And so I'm kind of thinking that slot position, for this conversation is a little bit on the side. Replacing Harrison Wallace, to me, you said at his best, he was kind of a safety blanket on the intermediate routes. And Drew Aller seemed to look at him, just to move the chains, live to fight another down, not necessarily a lot of deep shots in Harrison Wallace's direction. I'm thinking that's more Kyron Hudson, a guy who can catch the ball in traffic. That's a big skill of his. We've heard it on the practice field. That has translated since he came over from USC. He's also a physical and dependable receiver down the field, but he's not a burner. And so I think he's more of the replacement if you're talking about type of receiver for Harrison Wallace. And additionally, I think Omari Evans, I mentioned he played a little bit in the slot, but he was their big play guy, at this receiver position last year. He was the deep ball threat. He's also someone that as the season got later, Kotelnicki looked to get the ball in his hands as a runner. To me, I'm thinking that's really Devontae Ross in a lot of respects, a guy who was top 20 nationally last year in all-purpose yards per game. He's somebody that played about a quarter of his snaps last year in the slot. And so has experience outside, inside. And then when I look to Trevor Pena, I'm thinking, well, Liam Clifford is the one that's probably sweating that one out a little bit because he was looking like your primary slot receiver in spring ball. Now Pena come in. He was a dominant force for Syracuse a lot of last year out of the slot, a dependable player, 80-plus catches, 10-plus touchdowns on the season. But that's also where we saw Tyseer Denmark repping in the spring. That's also where we saw Kobe Howard repping in the spring, a freshman who has got a lot of buzz. So I'm not sure how it works with the slot and guys on the outside because I think Tyseer Denmark is certainly a guy who can split out wide, go to the perimeter. Lyric Samuel caught all of our attention in Beaver Stadium, and he has continued to build on that. He's an outside presence as well. So my initial way to lean in is towards those transfer receivers, but I'm going to bring Tyseer Denmark, perhaps Lyric Samuel, and certainly Liam Clifford in that conversation. And those are kind of the 6 guys I would think going into the spring. I don't mean to speak lightly of maybe what Caden Saunders has been able to accomplish this offseason or Anthony Ivey has been able to accomplish, but they haven't really accomplished much in a game setting. And thus far, there's not really that buzz that's going to say they're going to catapult their way into the starting conversation in the next 2 months. So that's where I am right now, Daniel. I do think it's more about those transfer receivers. I think it's fair to bring up that big group of returners. But right or wrong, I am leaning towards looking at some of these guys we haven't seen play much in a Penn State uniform because the results really haven't been there for the others thus far in their career. And over at offensive guard, this is probably about as black and white of a conversation as we'll have, I think, Daniel. You lose Sal Wormley, a 3-year starter on the right side for you on the offensive interior. He's now an NFL rookie. We do know that they can play Venga Ioane on the left side or the right side. Phil Trautwein said he has that versatility. But regardless, you need a new starting offensive guard opposite of a preseason All-American type in Venga Ioane. And it sure seems like it's going to be sophomore Cooper Cousins, who has received a plenty of praise from the staff, from the coaches, from us reporters, dating back to his recruitment process as a top 100 kid. Got to campus last year, burned red shirt. JB Nelson has moved on, transferred to Kansas State. And so the path is very clear right now. I know you got TJ Shanahan coming in as a guard from Texas A&M. You've got a 3rd-year guy who's maybe on the rise now in Alex Birchmeyer. And there are other pieces in play on the interior right now. But sure seems like we're going to see a swap of Cooper Cousins in for Sal Wormley, and it'll be up to some of the other interior offensive linemen to force Phil Trautwein to consider rotational reps for someone else.
Definitely. I agree with that assessment. I think that when you talk about the 1-for-1 replacement for Sal Wormley, Cooper Cousins is where your eyes are drawn to, your head goes just based on what we know. And then we'll see when the games start what these rotations look like. If anyone has forced the issue where not just in the late in the third quarter, or the fourth quarter against FIU, if someone maybe in the second quarter against Oregon, if someone is getting a little bit of run at one of those guard spots, and then on top of that, what it looks like when you do that rotation. When they rotated JB Nelson in last year, they moved Venga Ioane over to right guard and had Nelson at left guard, and taking Sal Wormley off the field. Like I think Ioane played the most offensive snaps other than Aller last year. He was
he played the most of anyone.
Yeah. So I think that shows that even if you're rotating, he's a guy who is not going to come off the field. So I think that we'll see what these non-conference games look like. Where guys are going to get some run. Maybe you get the quick hook early on some of these veterans to get these younger guys get their feet wet in Beaver Stadium, what that looks like. But I think that when you talk about right guard, you feel pretty good about where Cooper Cousins stands right now.
Maybe it's worth mentioning also that Venga Ioane took about 45 or so snaps last year beyond the traditional offensive line structure, about 25 in the slot. So you'll have two different guards in there. And I will add this note because I had a story up just a few days ago at Lions247.com from my visit to the offensive line room and spending some time with Phil Trautwein in the Lasch building. They are planning to use Anthony Donko and Javen Williams, not just as part of that right tackle competition with Nolan Rucci in preseason camp, but they want to get those guys work at right guard as well. So working on the entire right side. So Javen Williams, a former 5-star, and Anthony Donko, a guy who spent much of his freshman year here working at guard before he broke through at tackle in the Peach Bowl. Both of them are still kind of names to consider in this conversation. Let's look across the trenches, and there's a couple starters who are gone. Obviously, the most notable is All-American edge rusher Abdul Carter, put together one of the finest defensive seasons we've seen lately here in a Nittany Lions uniform, was the first defensive player off the board. I guess you got to say Travis Hunter goes both ways, so maybe it was technically him, but Abdul Carter to the Giants at number 3, and that's really high territory lately for Penn State, the highest draft pick since Saquon Barkley. So big shoes to fill there. And then at defensive tackle, Devon J. Thomas, not as glamorous of a departure, certainly, but he's off as an NFL rookie now with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he's somebody who broke through into the starting lineup a couple years ago, was a 6-year senior last year, a staple of that position room. And it's also a group that said goodbye to Hakeem Beamon and to Keziah Izzard. So Daniel, I should note, defensive end also said goodbye to Amin Vanover and Smith Vilbert. So we're not just talking about a starter needing to be replaced, but you're kind of rebuilding your 2 deep, and you've got to find a starter along the way.
Yeah, I'll start with defensive end and keep it pretty brief because I think we've talked a lot about that position after Max Granville's injury. We know that he was someone that we were expecting to see a lot of this year. We saw him last year. He was next guy up behind Abdul Carter, during the playoff run. And if Abdul Carter, if that injury is maybe a little bit worse, we see a lot of Max Granville in the Orange Bowl against Notre Dame. He was ready. That was his spot if Carter couldn't go or was more limited than he ended up being. So I think that the big question here is who's going to be your number 3, your number 4, even your number 5, because it's going to be a long season. We know that Penn State likes to rotate these guys through, keep them fresh. Deny Dennis Sutton, I think we know who he is. I think we're really interested to see if he can take things up another level as the guy, the number 1 with Abdul Carter moved on. Zariah Fisher is someone that we hear really good things about from inside the building. And we've gotten little glimpses of him here and there over the past couple of years at defensive end. And I think that there is reason for excitement with what he's able to do. But behind them, it's really, I think, wide open, for what people can do. You look at some of these younger guys like A. Mason Robinson, Malachi Williams, Jalen Harvey. Like, can they take a step forward in their development and put themselves in a position where they can rotate? Jordan Mayer did a lot of work on special teams last year. Is he someone that can have, a role there with defensive end too? And then are you going to get anything from an I White as a transfer from Texas A&M? Both of these Texas A&M guys, it sounds like, have really needed to do some work physically to get ready to play. We know what he was as a prospect coming out of Imhotep in Philadelphia. Hasn't really made good on it. So can he do that here under the guidance of Deion Barnes? And then Ivan Kamaju, I think, fits into that wild card category, like we've talked about, where we've gotten really good feedback about what he's able to do. I thought he looked really good in that blue-white game, looked like he belonged, but it's going to be a different animal when you're in October, November in this Big Ten schedule. So will he be in a position where he'll be able to contribute and make some things happen? So I think that this is one of the ones where when you talk about just the starting lineup and you put your first 22 guys out there on both sides of the ball, you look at defensive end and I think you feel pretty good. But as soon as you expand that into a 2 deep or a 3 deep, you see these guys that are going to need to step up, that are going to need to make things happen.
Yeah, this one requires you to use your imagination a bit because we just don't have long looks at so many of these guys like Deion Barnes has. And Barnes is another guy, another coach on the staff that I was able to spend some time with in his meeting room earlier this month. I know they're very high on Zuriah Fisher. I think everybody is kind of crossing their fingers when they talk about Zuriah Fisher because he's had a couple injury issues. He's dealt with significant adversity here on campus, on the field, off the field. And there's a lot of people cheering for him inside that building. And not just because it would be a feel-good story, but because he looks like their projected starting defensive end opposite of Denai Dennis Sutton. And I'll remind everybody that Denai Dennis Sutton looked like a first-round NFL draft pick during the postseason last year. He played the best football of his career with the light shining brightly. He's had a really big offseason, although we didn't get to see him much in spring ball. We've heard that he's really worked on his craft a lot with some professional input. And so really curious to see what it looks like from him. But I think the names to really watch here are Jalen Harvey. And I point to him because he has been the young defensive end who's been brought up the most since Max Granville was injured. Like you laid out, that there are several guys who you could kind of say, he's young. What does he look like? Harvey played a little bit last year. Like we said, it kind of looked like he suffered a terrible injury against Purdue, and he avoided it. It wasn't a big deal. So he comes back to the field this year, this August, with that Max Granville on that plan. And I think all of a sudden the attention on him is at a different level. I'm sure he's going to feel that a bit too. We'll see how he responds to it. And you mentioned Denai White. This guy was a top 50 recruit out of Philadelphia, but that was the same recruiting class that included Abdul Carter, who's now an NFL rookie making tens of millions of dollars in his contract. And Denai White has played, 3 or 4 games the past couple of seasons. An injury issue, there are perhaps some developmental issues down at Texas A&M, and it's hard to hang your hat on him being this guy who can handle 25-plus snaps with regularity. I think that's going to be the important thing is how comfortable do you feel loading up Zuriah Fisher with starters-level reps, especially right off the bat here this season? And let's also remember, if things go according to plan for Penn State on the field, they should be in a position on a scoreboard for each of their first 3 games leading up to that bye week in the Oregon matchup where they can get a lot of run to a lot of these dudes who haven't shown it in game action. And Ivan Kamaju comes to mind as well, the true freshman that they're very high on. I'm always cautious to put too many eggs in the basket of any freshman lineman on either side of the ball. But when you're talking about that 4th, 5th role, that could be pretty important this year and someone who could maybe be a factor, he kind of comes to mind for me as well. So there's a lot to do, but I said it when Max Granville got hurt. To me, I trust Deion Barnes. I think Penn State has proven their ability to develop edge rushers as well. But this is one of the more concerning spots for me on the roster, just as we look at it right now, 6 weeks out of preseason camp, because I think without elite presences on the edge consistently throughout the game, that can get you into some trouble against the teams that you need to beat if you want to achieve your ultimate goals. And if Penn State's in a situation where Denai Dennis Sutton is like an absolute force, and then you just kind of have a drop-off on the other side and you can't quite find the guy, then that to me kind of presents some exploitable potential for this defense that didn't exist last year, right, Daniel? So that's where I'm at with this. And defensive tackle kind of similar, right, where we've got this huge group of young, unproven talent, and then you've got the one guy who's back and everybody thinks is going to be great.
Yeah, I think that defensive tackle is really similar to defensive end, but I think you feel a little bit better about defensive tackle than you do defensive end, which, it's still a bunch of, second, third year guys who haven't played much. But I think that you've heard the arrow pointing up, I think, longer for some of these guys. Maybe you talk about, like, I think right now, just to reset, I think we see Zane Durant, Alonzo Ford as the top two guys coming out of here. But then we were hearing really good things about Xavier Gilliam down the stretch last year, and I think we were in sort of a wait and see mode in the playoff if he was going to really make a leap into that rotation and take it from a 3-man rotation of Izzard, Jay Thomas, who am I missing? Durant after Ford's injury. Yeah, he was going to take that from a 3-man rotation to a 4-man rotation. I think that we were really interested in that. And a similar thing with Ty Blanding. Like, was Ty Blanding going to force that issue a little bit? I thought Blanding looked really good in that blue-white game. He's one of those guys that has a similar, I think, frame, similar body type to Zane Durant. And we've seen what that kind of guy can do in the middle of a defensive line. And so, yeah, I think that when you talk about Blanding, Gilliam, I think Liam Andrews is someone that we are really excited to see in action. And, seeing him out there in the blue-white game, you could, with that, he's 6'4", 286 right now, you could see the problems that frame can cause. And I think that you feel optimistic about what he can do. Owen Wafel, the transfer from Michigan, a little bit of a different body type, seems like a really good space filler. And then Randy Adarica was someone that there was, little bits and pieces of good feedback on. Like you said, freshman lineman. I'm fine slow playing a guy. I'm fine being late on, a guy, or, not expecting him to do much and being wrong that way as opposed to the opposite direction. So we'll see. But I think that it's a similar, like you see that 2 deep, or that, top 2 of Durant and Ford, you feel really good about it. When you expand it down 2-3 more spots, it's unproven, similar to defensive end. But I think that these are guys that we've heard a lot about, that we've seen in different bits and pieces. And I think that you feel good about, what they can accomplish when the lights come on. Another group where those first 3 non-conference games going to be really important to see what we have.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that when they get on the field in early August, it's going to be Zane Durant, Alonzo Ford, and Xavier Gilliam as the top 3. We'll see where Alonzo Ford is and shaking off any rust that he may have lingering. He missed the playoff run last year. He got hurt in November with an injury. Unfortunately, he missed a bunch of time the year before, his first year with Penn State after transferring to Old Dominion. But when he was available last year, he was a really important part of the plan at defensive tackle. So I think he'll get a chance to go out and win a starting job. He was a 2-year starter at Old Dominion before he got here. But I think Xavier Gilliam has a chance as a young rising redshirt freshman to push him there. And Zane Durant, a lot of people talking about him as one of the premier defensive tackles in college football this year. There is a group of freshman eligible players that, like you, I can't wait to see more of. And I hope we get to see a lot more of them in August. Liam Andrews, Owen Wafel coming in from Michigan as a redshirt freshman, didn't play last year. And then Randy Adarica, who you mentioned, as a true freshman. And so kind of a mix of where these guys are coming in from their careers. But I could see any of those 3 really staking claim to maybe a 5th defensive tackle job as Penn State works its way from September to October. Let's be honest, this is a position that rarely reaches the regular season finale intact due to health issues. And so a guy like Ty Blanding, a redshirt sophomore, I don't know, we just referenced him. He's got kind of a similar body type to Durant. Mm-hmm. And I think Owen Wafel does too. And so these guys are a little bit more compact, but perhaps they bring a little bit more speed and agility to the interior. Now, big bodies, Liam Andrews is going to fit that bill. Randy Adarica is trending in that direction. Caleb Artis has really kind of fit that mold for a while, but unfortunately his availability has been a question mark for much of his career. He wasn't on the field to finish last season, and now as a redshirt junior, we didn't see him for most of spring practice as well. So again, a lot of names there. Maybe you feel a little bit better about what's at the very top than you do at defensive end, but both those rooms going to have a long looks from Deion Barnes and the rest of that staff in the weeks ahead. Over in the defensive backfield, before we get to linebacker, one cornerback, Jalen Kimber, has moved on as an NFL rookie. And then you've got 2 safeties, one of which wasn't available for you much last season, but KJ Winston and Jalen Reed, mainstays of the defense for the Nittany Lions for much of their careers. And so when you look at what Terry Smith and Anthony Poindexter are dealing with in their replacement efforts, I think cornerback, you feel like there's a lot more maybe ready talent that has proven it in games before. And I think when you go over to safety, it's a little bit of a more of a mixed bag. And you kind of say, well, you have faith in Poindexter, but somebody's going to have to step up that hasn't really done it before.
Yeah, I think cornerback is pretty straightforward right now. AJ Harris coming back as a returning starter. He's your top dog. Elliott Washington had a great offseason. He's in there. And then Audavian Collins as well. I think that those three are going to play starter reps. It sounds like where we were in the spring, Harris and Washington were your first two up with Collins rotating in. But that seems like the group. And that's another thing. Is someone going to try to force the issue, get playing time? Like a Darius Dixon, like a Kenny Woolsey, can they make an impact? I think factor in the slot too. That's an interesting one with when you talk about both cornerbacks and safeties, where Zion Tracy could be in the mix for that. King Mack could be in the mix for that. Kenny Woolsey got some time there. And then I think that a couple of the other safeties have the physical traits, body type to be in there. I think when you talk about safety next to Zachy Wheatley, I think Dejon Lane opens it as maybe your top guy there. Given the experience that he got last year, I think we've heard really good things about that. Last year was difficult for him, that he really took his lumps, at the safety spot as a true freshman. And I think we saw it in terms of the playing time breakdown. Different guys we saw back there, how much Lane we saw over the course of the season, and how Penn State really had to alter its plan on the fly after that KJ Winston injury. But it sounds like Lane has done a good job of, learning from that, applying things, and now is in a good spot going into year two. Antoine Belgrave Shorter, I think he's someone we saw a lot of in the blue-white game, and someone who I think is in position to potentially make a move, get some real playing time. And then Vavu Torre is back as well. Lamont Payne is back. I thought that both of them played physical in the blue-white game. You can see how they fit. And then Raz Thomas, we'll see. Same thing with a freshman. He's got the traits, got the tools. I know Tyler Calvaruso is a big fan of him as an athlete and what he can do. Let's see how he, refines himself this summer, this fall, and everything. And then, I mentioned King Mack when it comes to the nickel. He's back. Let's see how he fits in, what he can do. I know that guys really like him in terms of his intangibles. And then he also brings that speed that, you're going to need that, especially when you get late into the season. You're seeing Ohio State, these top programs, Oregon, you're going to need his speed out there.
Yeah, the great news at both those spots is they love the returning starters that they have there. I know Zachy Wheatley is a big, has a lot of fans in that last building right now, and he has developed that. He's earned those fans as well with a lot of his efforts in the past couple of years, particularly. And then you look at AJ Harris. I believe Terry Smith told us this spring that he has All-American potential here as a junior, a former 5-star who transferred in from Georgia last year. And I'll just note a couple of names that one of which I've been intrigued by for a couple of years, didn't really come to fruition on the field last fall, but Colin Dinkins. We talked about his brother Khalil Dinkins at tight end. But with some of the movement we saw, with some of the guys sidelined this spring, he got a little bit extra run. I thought he did some good things with it, playing some of that slot coverage. And then speaking of slot coverage, that was where we saw Zion Tracy really emerge as the primary guy above Cam Miller by the end of last year. Miller's now at Rutgers as a senior transfer. Tracy was out of sight for us for spring ball, dealing with some kind of injury recovery. But there's a lot of names, and there's a few different positions, and depending on what Jim Knowles wants to do, series by series basis, there is room for us to see plenty of defensive backs featured yet again from this unit in 2025. Let's finish over at linebacker, where you've got one departure, and it's a pretty important one because he was a team captain last year. He was your leading tackler last year, and he also wore that green dot. So he was the guy bringing the call down from the coaching staff to his teammates. Kobe King, now a Minnesota Vikings rookie. And this is, speaking of defensive changes and adjustments with the new coordinator, we know the 4-2-5 defense is going to be a calling card here for Jim Knowles. We're not quite sure how frequently we'll see 3 linebackers utilized. So perhaps everybody's sense of that traditional Mike linebacker and what he's supposed to look like could get kind of redefined a bit.
Yeah, this is one where, I think this might be the position battle with maybe the most uncertainty going into the fall, where we are now could look a lot different on August 30th and maybe could look different into October and November. When you talk about, guys at different stages of their careers, guys with different skill sets, and the variable of a new scheme. And these guys are going to be asked to do things, differently than they were under Tom Allen, under Manny Diaz, for the ones that have been around that long. I think that in terms of guys who have played the most, guys with the most experience in Penn State uniforms, you start with Tony Rojas and Dominic DeLuca. And then from there, can one of these other guys, force the issue? I've been using that phrase too much, but, can they put themselves in a position where, okay, in this situation, you're on the field over Dom DeLuca, or even, we want you on the field instead of Tony Rojas, in a certain spot. What's that going to look like? And I think there are the guys that you can have some unique combinations. You can, guys can do different things. You can use guys in different situations. It's just the thing where we haven't really seen any of these guys do it in a Penn State uniform yet. I think that Keon Wiley is someone that there's been some excitement about, some buzz about in his development. He's coming off an injury. Anthony Specca redshirted last year. And there was a little bit of a will he, won't he, in terms of could they greenlight him, given where they were. But he's got that playoff experience, and he looks like someone who is ready to take another step forward. Kyrie Jackson, that's your guy. He is someone that is physical, brings that element. I know Dan Connor had some good things to say to you about him. And then Amari Campbell, like where, how does he fit in as a transfer, coming in, when he does at this point in the year. We know he was the green dot at UNC, had a ton of production there. I think that those are skills that can translate to the Penn State defense, but he's going to have to compete with other guys. He's going to have to earn his way onto the field. I think this linebacker group, you've got a lot of pieces. It's just, how's the puzzle going to fit together through fall camp into the season in this Jim Knowles defense?
And possession by possession, as we said.
Yeah.
And so a few things here in terms of leadership, because you lost a really good one in Kobe King. I think they're in a really good spot. By all accounts, Tony Rojas is a rising leadership figure within this locker room. He's been a lot more vocal this offseason. I tried to push Dan Connor when I stopped into his team meeting, into his linebacker meeting room, and maybe saying that's who we're going to put the green dot on his helmet, but he didn't go that far. We know that Dom DeLuca has been a team captain a couple different times on special teams. He's a guy that a lot of people in this linebacker room look up to. And then Amari Campbell, although it was with a different program last year, he was a leader that people looked toward during a relatively tough Tar Heel season. He was a guy who stepped up and gave some words in the locker room when it needed to be said. He certainly was the one calling the plays on the field. So I like what they have from a vocal and accountability standpoint with some of these pieces, but from a performance standpoint, really curious to see what those mixes and matches look like, because Amari Campbell flourished as a guy who could really get to the backfield, not necessarily as an edge type, but through the A gap, B gap, a really natural blitzer. I know that's something that Dan Connor loved about his game, bringing him in. So what kind of buttons do they want to push with him in this defense and Jim Knowles? I think Anthony Specca is probably the guy who's made the biggest leap from last year in terms of who's still on this roster. And, there had to be some temptation to burn his red shirt last year. They flirted with it. It didn't happen. I think he played in 7 games by the end of the year because he got postseason action. But in terms of his IQ, his mental growth within a new defense for Jim Knowles, and someone who is just kind of taking things in stride, everything has really been positive on the feedback with Specca. He's got a sweet mustache now, which is always going to add some points too. And then my guy, Kyrie Jackson. If you're looking for anyone in terms of a physical comparison to Kobe King, he's probably it in this room. A big, physical, thick type player. Started his football career early on at defensive tackle, transitioned to the second level of the defense, shed some baby fat during his first year on campus while he was sidelined with an injury. And he's somebody that Dan Connor, you talked about him being physical. I'll just take it to the next level, because I think I mentioned this on the podcast before. Maybe I didn't, but Connor says he thinks that Jackson can be the most physical member of this linebacker room, and perhaps the most physical player on defense. So somebody that we haven't seen in game action yet, somebody who only has, maybe 20 practices under his belt in a Nittany Lions uniform, but I wouldn't write him off just because he's been out of sight. He's got to prove he can stay healthy. be on the field, but he's also somebody that you throw in there along with the Keon Wiley, who's coming back from his own injury. So I'm with you, Daniel. There's a bunch of names that we can point to. You can point to some production in some of these cases, but Dan Connor is a challenge for a guy in his first year as the full-fledged linebackers coach. I know he essentially was that guy last year, but I think he's going to have a lot of leeway here and to come up with a plan for his room, how that works within Jim Knowles' defense, and collaboratively they're going to need to have 4, 5, maybe 6 linebackers who they feel confident can play down to down, ready on the sideline. I don't know if they felt that way last year. Remember, it was a pretty precarious situation outside the starting lineup in terms of guys they were getting reps to last year. Dakari Nelson, Tamir Robinson, Anthony Specca, they barely played last year. So we'll see if they flash a little more depth come game action in 2025. Daniel, that's going to be it. We got Tyler coming up next with some recruiting conversation, but good 45 minutes with you here, working our way through these starting jobs and what's at stake and who's in the mix. And we threw a lot your way. Hopefully we'll be able to narrow this conversation a little bit in a couple months come mid-August when we have more eyes on the team and a little bit more context about some of these position battles. But Daniel, like we said, it's around the corner and a lot more coverage coming over at Lions247.com.
Thanks, Tyler.
This episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast continues with focus on recruiting. We are joined live in person in my house by Tyler Calvaruso right now. We are fresh off of Penn State's practice fields where we got a chance to see Penn State's latest elite prospect showcase event. We got to see some commits, some targets out there. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I think first things first, as we record this on a Wednesday, this is going to go live on a Friday, but some bad news to get out of the way here in Penn State recruiting. Some not so lovely trends for the Nittany Lions right now, and including a result that we just we learned that broke just moments ago.
Yeah, Grayson McKee going off the board to Notre Dame. It was one. Let's just call it how it is. It looked like Penn State was going to get that one done for an extended period of time, right? There's a lot going for the Nittany Lions in that recruitment. McKee gets back to Notre Dame for an official visit, and the Fighting Irish turn the tide completely in their favor. That's one of many recruitments that, again, just got to call it how it is, not looking the best for Penn State right now. That one's in the books. Joey O'Brien's announcing on Friday. Notre Dame's heavily in the mix to get that one done. They're heavily in the mix to land Corey Adams, Luke Wafel, who's a top target on the edge, Ohio State, USC, generating a lot of buzz as his recruitment is nearing its end. So it's a tough spot for Penn State right now. They're still fighting the fight. McKee is off the board, but those guys are still out there for the taking. And James Franklin and his staff, they're going to do whatever they have to do to get those guys on board until they commit. And even beyond that as well, these recruitments, they're going to go all the way until these guys put pen to paper. But right now, it's a tough time.
I've got a big picture question for you in a moment, but first things first, with Grayson coming off the board, he's obviously been an in-state priority for a while. Phil Trautwein's board has reflected that, as you've talked about. With him now going to Notre Dame, announcing that publicly, where does Penn State stand in its search to grow this offensive line class? Who might be next to join, and where might Penn State turn in another direction?
We'll start looking all at Marlon Bright, right? Paul Catholic standout. He's been a top target for the staff for an extended period of time. He's announcing July 5th. Penn State still looks to be in a really good spot to get that one done. Again, Bright doesn't have any other official visits scheduled. He hasn't had any since he visited Penn State during that May 30th through the June 1st weekend. It actually sounds like he's going to be back on campus sooner rather than later with Lasch Bash coming up. So that's another positive in favor of the Nittany Lions. Again, looking at Bright to eventually join this class when it's all said and done. Looks pretty good. But now you got to kind of look at your board. And you got to look at some guys who were maybe second-tier targets. Doesn't mean they're not really, really good players. Guys like J.B. Chavez, Thomas Wilder, Jack Fuchs, just those kinds of guys. Even a Charlie Thumb kind of guy who popped on the radar late for Penn State, took an official visit this past weekend. He's trending towards Notre Dame. So there are some guys that you're either going to have to cross off and you're going to have to start looking elsewhere. That being said, it's a very, very talented board. It has been for a while, even beyond losing Grayson McKee and a guy like Marky Walbridge, who's a top target from Massachusetts, trending to a program like Michigan. There is still plenty of talent available for the taking, and Phil Trautwein has kind of worked up a reputation where he's going to get his guys and he's going to get them coached up to the best of his ability. And I think no matter who Penn State brings in this cycle, it's going to be a qualitative haul on the offensive line. Again, tough blow losing McKee. You got to rework your board a little bit now, but there's confidence that can be done in a quality manner.
Well, now big picture, because if Penn State does suffer a few blows here on the recruiting trail, and again, Joey O'Brien announcing on Friday as we record, doesn't seem to be trending toward Happy Valley for the top in-state prospect, a 5-star talent, safety, but as also discussed both sides of the ball with Nittany Lions staff. And so, Tyler, if they were to suffer these losses, and Kari Adams among them, one of the top cornerbacks in the country, he doesn't end up here, and you get through this process, for you, is that a blip on the radar for Penn State? Is this something they can battle back from? And probably too light of a phrase and blip with on the radar, but is this a momentary moment of angst for Penn State fans that you think they can bounce back from on this recruiting trail? Or is this maybe more indicative of what could be a tough close despite high expectations for the season?
I think it's something Penn State can bounce back from because there are still high-quality targets left on the board. That being said, again, it's just another deal. We have to call it what it is. Joey O'Brien's a 5-star prospect. Kari Adams, the number 3 cornerback in the nation. Grayson McKeon is a composite 4-star prospect. Luke Wafel, if he is to land elsewhere, he's a top 24/7 edge rusher who's right on the brink of being a top 100 guy.
With a brother on campus. On
exactly.
The team, right.
So rankings-wise, maybe you could say goodbye to the dream of the class ranking as highly as the 2022 group. Mm-hmm. It's something we've discussed throughout the cycle, that there are so many high-quality, highly ranked names within the region still available for Penn State. And that could be something that takes this class really to the next level from a rankings perspective. Maybe you could say goodbye to that, but that doesn't mean it's still not going to be a good class. Just because you miss on all of your top guys, again, it's a tough blow if that's what winds up happening. We still have to see how these things are going to play themselves out. We all know these recruitments are still going to come down to the final hour, and we've seen moves been made from Penn State and other programs in the final hour of recruitments time and time again. I mean, just look back to the 2025 cycle. Penn State came in late for Andrew Olish. So it's never over until it's over. That being said, you're going to have to go to some guys who maybe a little bit further down the board. So you're moving not necessarily from plan A to plan B, but maybe plan 1A to 1B. Sure. And where does that leave your class when it's all said and done? From a rankings perspective, it's going to be what it's going to be, but Penn State still likes what it has on the board. So I think there is bounce back ability here.
Last I checked, number 7 class nationally, 20 commits on board. Elijah Littlejohn, the North Carolina linebacker inside the top 24/7, hopped on board earlier this week. We broke it down on an episode that dropped Tuesday. Tyler, we'll talk about the big weekend ahead for Penn State. Maybe there are some silver linings to gain from this week as they get more targets on campus for this 2026 class. But let's start with where we just got out of. That's the camp. You were here for a reason, and it's not just to have some Chinese food with me tonight, but it was to spend a few hours on Penn State's practice fields. We got a look at some future Nittany Lions along the way, and I got to begin again where I kind of wrapped up a couple camps ago, and that is Jasir Rogers is a blue chip type receiver. I mean, there's no question about it in my mind, and wherever the rankings land, they land. But I think just rest assured out there, Nittany Lions Nation, that Penn State has a really legitimate playmaker in this class at wide receiver. Not to say they don't have it in the other guys as well. We know he's not the highest rated recruit in this class, but he belongs in the discussion of who could come and make an impact on campus based on what we've seen now 3 different times on campus. There was that June 8th Elite Showcase that I know you weren't at, but you saw the highlights I put together, kind of made my case for him to get a reassessment of his ranking situation on our site at Lions 24/7. And then he was back on campus, and we both saw him at the mini camp playing with Peyton Falzone and some other quarterbacks, a smaller group last Friday. And here he was, and leading those receiver lines, working with the staff again, Mark Dupuis, the assistant in that position room, and then, of course, receivers coach Marcus Hagans. You've got Andy Kotelnicki and James Franklin getting their long looks, having conversations. He is all in, clearly, on trying to indoctrinate himself on the Penn State culture. And I'm telling you, based on the talent we've seen, the physical maturation as well, and the speed that he's already showcased, he's the guy that if he comes to campus with both of his feet solidly on the ground and what life's going to be like within that facility, I think he can have a shot to push for some opportunities as a freshman.
Wouldn't surprise me. I'm in the same camp as you at this point. I don't really care what the kid's ranking is. I think we know what kind of player and prospect Jasir Rogers is. Between the combination of speed, agility, vertical, the hands. We can't
shortchange that because Mark Brennan, who you all know his coverage at Lions 24/7, he put together the video package that we have up this week on Jasir Rogers' Wednesday performance. And he said this kid's hands are elite. And this was coming off of a practice where there was a camp where there was a downpour for sporadically and then for like the final 15 minutes or so. And he's out there still exhibiting that kind of wet ball ability. And I know James Franklin says there's a ton of value in seeing your receivers and your running backs and your quarterbacks play in the rain. We got to do that a little bit today, and it didn't really impact him. And again, really a strong pickup here for Marcus Hagans and for the Penn State staff. And a kid that if he's in a different environment at the high school level, a different state, more populated area where there's more prospects, this might be a tooth and nail kind of fight where Penn State's got to battle a bunch of royalty in college football. Fortunately for them, it worked out for them as it did. Maybe he would have liked to experience a more high-profile recruitment, but end of the road is Happy Valley. That's a big-time destination for this kid, and I think he can rest assured, like, okay, maybe I didn't get to find that 5-star recruitment process that I maybe foresaw for myself. I didn't get to go all over the country and get wined and dined, but I found my fit at Penn State. They found a fit in me early. And I think there's a lot of trust on both sides.
There is. And let me be clear, with Jasir Rogers, we're not just talking about a kid who it's all athletic upside. He still has to grow as a receiver. He has an advanced receiver skill set. I mean, I think he's just the kind of prospect who you hit the nail on the head, really. If he's located anywhere else geographically, we're talking about a kid where all the big dogs are involved. And one thing that surprised me with Jasir Rogers is, spring contact period, there are oftentimes schools will circle back with the guy, or they'll go to a place like Appoquinimink and see a guy like Jasir Rogers, and there just hasn't been a whole lot of outside interest, and it's been pretty surprising. But Penn State staff's not complaining. I can tell you that. They're not complaining about the ranking either, because they know what they have in Jasir Rogers. They are bullish on his potential. I think every time Marcus Hagan and Mark Dupree see Jasir Rogers in a camp setting, they get more and more excited about what he could potentially bring to this wide receiver depth chart when he arrives in State College full-time. Really, really a special kind of talent. I mean, there are a few kids in this class who we've talked about in this ilk. Jasir Rogers, he's another guy we're going to continue to circle in this way, because I think he's that good. You think he's that good. There are a lot of people inside of Lasch who think he's that good.
Yeah, we also saw Leighton Von Brandt, 2027, and a high school teammate down in Delaware there of Rogers. He's a year younger than Rogers is, and one of the top 100 recruits right now in our rankings at 24/7 Sports. I think it was another kind of up and down camp for him. I think you judge a lot of these guys based on how they perform on one-on-one settings, right? And Leighton Von Brandt's getting a lot of work from this Penn State staff. We've now seen him 3 different times in the past 4 or 5 weeks at an Elite 11 All-22 camp, twice now here on campus. And, it hasn't been a dominant from start to finish kind of performance from Leighton Von Brandt, but you see the body of work, you see the reach that he has, and, the physical, kind of tools. It's also a kid that cares a lot, and it pisses him off to lose. But I get the sense from him he's not pleased how some of these one-on-one drills have gone for him. But he's showing up. The Penn State coaching staff has put him through the ringer. He's only halfway through high school. So I'm excited to see how he bounces back. I know he's going to have a big junior season, but he's probably got a lot of self-critiques that he's going to implement for himself going in his preseason camp. I know Phil Troutwine and the staff have their tips and what they think can guide him along to take the next step. But I would bet good money that when we see Leighton Von Brandt show up next summer to these camps, and he's a rising senior at that point, and he's well established as a Penn State commit, we're going to see not only a guy who's physically more advanced, but I think mentally and kind of rep by rep, he's going to be more in command of his situation.
I just wrote it in our camp notebook. I think his best football is still ahead of him. He's just got to find consistency. I think that's the one thing that's really been lacking in these one-on-ones. He gets tired sometimes and his fundamentals go by the wayside. I mean, that's something James Franklin pulled him to the side and kind of preached in the middle of camp. When you get tired and you get fatigued, you got to rely on your fundamentals. Mm-hmm. You got to be able to fall back on your fundamentals. If anything, your fundamentals have to get better. Yeah. Because a lot of the athleticism and just overall physical dominance that Leighton Von Brandt has and why he thrives as an offensive lineman in Delaware, that disappears when you get tired throughout the course of the game. And that's why James Franklin puts these guys through the gauntlet during one-on-one work. He wants to see how they handle getting tired and the heat of the battle that you face during a game. And you see some guys rise to the occasion in camp. Some guys, they get a little bit tired. Von Brandt, it was very hit or miss again, I would say. But watching him go through drill work, just seeing really the physicality and the nature he attacks the sled and the way he goes through bag work, you see all of the upside that has him as a top 100 prospect in the 27 class and why he is viewed so highly inside of Lasch. So again, the best is still ahead of him. Consistency is going to be the big thing, I think, moving forward, but I'm confident he'll get there.
We did see Isaac Chukwura continuing the Delaware theme, defensive lineman, working his way towards being a college defensive tackle. He can attack off the edge as well. And we got good looks at him throughout this early summer period. Again, this week, I think just reinforcing he is clearly a rising figure, really a good scouting evaluation by Penn State to get him when they got him. His trajectory pointing way up, and I love where you think he will land at defensive tackle a few years down the road. I want to just finish up our camp eval real quick. By the way, full notebook up at lions247.com. Full photo gallery. We have video highlights from camp as well up by now, and a few more camps coming this weekend that you can look for coverage at lions247.com. But there's an uncommitted player out there, a young rising edge rusher that really had our attention throughout camp today as well.
Abraham Cisse is a 27 from Downington East High, so he's an in-state guy. He's been moving up that defensive line board for Deion Barnes, and I think after this performance, he's going to just continue to rise. Has all the athletic tools you want, I think, in a young and budding pass rusher. He's not just a freak athlete. He fires off the ball. He uses his hands well. Really, probably more refined technically than I expected him to be when I first saw him at Under Armour, New Jersey. That was my first look at him in a camp setting. Now we see him again today in State College, and he just keeps getting better and better, man. Tested really well, ran the 40 and the 4.6s. So just a lot for a coaching staff to work with at the power forward level. And Penn State's prioritizing him in this 27 class. That board's still coming together. We're still a ways away from really zoning in on the top guys at each position just because the focus is on 26 right now. But Abraham Cisse is a guy where you're going to be talking about a lot because I anticipate he's going to have a really, really good junior year playing in Pennsylvania, and I think some more big-time programs are going to come call him.
Deion Barnes certainly liked what he saw based on what we observed. And so let's finish our final few minutes of this podcast episode and this recruiting segment on what lies ahead this weekend. There is the final 7-on-7 tournament Big Man Challenge on Friday. There'll be coverage at lions247.com. There is a whiteout camp on Sunday, which is going to be probably more of an exclusive vibe to it because it leads up to the Lasch Bash. And that's something that's normally on the calendar in July. Explain to us why that's not in July anymore and just how big Sunday could be from an evaluation standpoint and from a recruiting standpoint for Penn State staff.
Yeah, Lasch Bash is definitely at the center of this weekend. There's still some official visits taking place, but Lasch Bash is the center of this weekend for Penn State. And normally it was an end of July kind of deal. It was a big-time recruiting for Penn State at the end of July. No longer the case. NCAA changed up its recruiting calendar. All of July is now a dead period. So that's blacked out. You can't have Lasch Bash late July like you have over and over again. Now you move to this last week of June. And it's an interesting dynamic because, sometimes in the past, Lasch Bash, you saw some current class targets who had already taken official visits pop back up for unofficial visits. It's a little bit tougher to do that now, given the timeline of it all. So it's more of a commit and underclassmen-centric event. But it is still a big-time recruiting event for Penn State. And as you highlighted, a big-time evaluation opportunity as well with the whiteout camp, which is actually going to take place before Lasch Bash. In past years, sometimes we've seen Lasch Bash and then whiteout camp. This year, it's going to be reversed. Whiteout camp in the morning, Lasch Bash barbecue afterwards. Going to be a lot of top targets in the region making it to State College to enjoy that time with the staff, get to know those guys a little bit more away from the football field. But then in the morning, put in the work with the coaching staff, get that valuable coaching feedback as they proceed in their high school career. So it's going to be a big time weekend at State College. It's going to be a busy weekend for the staff, but we're winding down a busy recruiting time, and the underclassmen are now at the center of it.
Yeah, the barbecue should be good too, from what I hear.
The food's always good, apparently.
It's a big annual event, and coverage will be all over lions247.com on Sunday, and then coming out of Sunday, I'm sure into early to midweek next week. And I know generally, Tyler, coming out of June, it's a good time, especially how the calendar is now. You're going to probably have a lot of resets in terms of where the board is. We're going to have some commitments coming up and just starting to look toward the next phase, which I would probably call kind of the closing phase for Penn State. We're not in the fall yet, but you're looking to finish out, say the last 25 to 30% of your class, and you're also trying to go win a national championship, and maybe those two things can help each other, right? And so appreciate the coverage, man. You've been up to my house, 3 or 4 times here in the last couple of weeks for these camps. It's not an easy drive all the time. So big respect to Tyler Calvaruso, how he's covered our recruiting world at 24/7 Sports. It feels like we're living in the recruiting world in June.
We definitely are.
And we'll try to let you get off the gas pedal a little bit in July and August, and we'll take the baton and we'll be full speed ahead in preseason camp coverage. But be sure to check out lions247.com throughout this weekend, because official visitors, any names throughout there before we say goodbye in terms of that really stands out to you from this last weekend of official visits?
Mentioned Jack Fuchs earlier. He's an intriguing offensive tackle target again with that board shaking out in a certain way right now. You got to keep an eye on guys like him. And then Cam Brickle defensive tackle. He's playing his final year of high school ball down at IMG Academy in Florida. He's a Pennsylvania native, used to play at Malvern Prep. He's on that D tackle board, and that's a spot where Penn State wants to add another body. So those are the guys I have served. Oh, of course, Pierce Peterson, the 4-star tight end from Minnesota. I mean, he's Ty Howell's top target at the position right now. And Penn State's going to have a chance to close on him this weekend. Right now, it's down to the Nittany Lions, Minnesota. It's not easy to go into Minnesota and pry a top guy away from PJ Fleck, right? But that's what the Nittany Lions have a chance to do this weekend.
Speaking of almost forgetting things, Peter Bork was part of this Wednesday camp crew, and he's the top 100 quarterback, a priority for Penn State in the 2027 cycle. So we plan on getting highlights up from his camp performance, and then, of course, full photo gallery from that. Take a look at the young quarterback and a lot more over at Lions247.com. 50% off going on right now for a crazy recruiting weekend and a crazy part of this month. Tyler, good stuff. Appreciate you, man. Big thanks to Daniel Gallen, Mark Brennan, Grace Brennan, who shared the field with us on Wednesday and often contribute in ways that you don't necessarily see on this podcast.
That's
so
sure.
We'll talk to you all real soon. On behalf of the crew, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.